Welcome, everyone. I am very excited to have all of you with me here today. I am Daisy Khan. The aim of the Sacred Circle of Sisters is to embark collectively so we can support each other's individual quest for the divine and also aid the global consciousness transformation that's already underway. And that is why I have brought together this amazing group of women that have spent all their lives in delving into the Quran and in delving in their teachers, their guides, their academics. And so let us all invite Simi Ghazi from Canada to give us a recitation.
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم ألم نشرح لك صدرك ووضعنا عنك وزرك الذي أنقض ظهرك ورفعنا لك ذكرك فإن مع العسر يسرا إن مع العسر يسرا فإذا فرغت فانصب وإلى ربك فارغب صدق الله العظيم. I'm going to read from Michael Sell's Approaching the Quran translation, which I had the privilege of being introduced to when I was 18 as a student, and which probably made being Muslim possible for me, and which I then edited many years later. Surah Inshirah, the laying open. In the name of God, the compassionate, the caring, did we not lay open your heart and relieve you of the burden that was breaking your back? Did we not honor your name? After the hard time, there is the easing. After the hard time, there is the easing. When you finish, strive again, and in your Lord aspire ardently. And I just wanted to say that this verse, Inna ma'al usri yusra, Inna ma'al usri yusra, after the hard time, there is the easing, uses this preposition ma'a, and it's been interpreted as after, but ma'a also means with. And amak means I'm with you, together with you. So the usr and the yusr, the difficulty, the ease, they are with one another. They come together. And not only that, I realized that they are within one another. They're like the yin and the yang. One contains the seed of the other. And one of my great struggles in this time has been, on the one hand, I've known 18 people who had this illness. 2 I know have passed away. Many others were seriously sick. And at the same time, there's been this quiet and this cessation and this deep appreciation of the beauty of the small things. You know, just suddenly standing in my garden in the morning and Vancouver is in bloom. And birds are singing like they've never sung before because there's not traffic and because I have time to hear them. And I've almost felt like, how can I take in and accept these moments of beauty when there's also death around us and suffering, economic suffering, so many kinds of suffering. And this verse helped me to realize that the hardship and the ease are both coming from Allah. We need to have the strength and the resilience to greet the hardship and to alleviate others' hardship. And one way we accomplish that is by receiving the ease and the beauty, the slowing down, the renewed connections that have also been part of this time. And we allow that to strengthen us, because none of us knows tomorrow whether we will be the one who's ill or someone very dear to us. So I hope that you can accept the easing and the difficulty. It all comes from Allah. We have to drink it all in deep. We have to weave it together. And this is what it is to be muwahida. It is the ones who weave all the realities and complexities together to create unity, to create oneness.
My co-hosts of this event are Sahar, Susan, and Minu. We have been working on this Sunday Spiritual Salon together starting in January, and they have distinct roles. Sahar is a television writer, producer, Interfaith Fellow, Green Faith. She's a, mashallah, massive activist. Minu is a global consciousness activist, has spent all her life in corporate America. She's a speaker, blogger, writer, and she's also going to be doing facilitations today. And Susan is Director of Operations of Fellowship of Reconciliation, where she's also a, mashallah, massive activist in New York City. She's at every place you can think of, and a writer. She's written a beautiful book on the prophets, on all the prophets of Islam. And so I turn over now to Sahar to just say hello to all of you.
Hear me the first time?
Yes. Yeah, go ahead, Sahar.
Okay, Assalamu alaikum, everybody. Welcome, inshallah. May this be a blessed time for all of us. Thank you all for coming.
Hey everyone. I'll be playing the role of a facilitator. And one of the things I'm going to be doing is putting in the chat and monitoring the chat for your questions. And I'll also be reading the names of the people who are attending, because we cannot introduce everybody with the time we have. So I'll be looking at the chat. And so put your name, your location, and one word that describes you. So for example, for me, I'm told I'm a peacekeeper. So that's my one word that I want you to know about me. And
Assalamu alaikum, everyone. I am so happy to be with this big group, mashallah, 98 participants so far. I am seeing faces I haven't seen in 15 years, mashallah. And I really just, give so much praise to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala first, but also Daisy and Minu and Sahar and the rest of the sisters. But Daisy, this is amazing that you've pulled this together, and it shows that we're never too old to learn, mashallah.
Go ahead, Susan.
It is my great honor now to introduce the first speaker, Dr. Lala Bakhtiar. And just a short caveat, Dr. Lala is not feeling so well, so she won't be speaking at length today, but inshallah she will more in the future. I'm going to highlight a few points from her bio, and you see it on the screen in front of you. She is a translator of the Holy Quran, mashallah, a critical translator. And she was born to an American mother from Idaho, from, the potato state, and had an Iranian father in Tehran. She grew up in LA and DC as a Catholic with her American mom. And at the age of 19, she met Sayyid Hussein Nasr in Boston, who told her that people would expect her to be a Muslim because her father is a Muslim. And she said that having grown up in America, she knew nothing about Islam. And he said to her in a commanding voice, well, learn. And then this is where her journey began. And at the age of 24, she moved to Iran with her husband. She studied at Tehran University, Quranic Arabic, Persian, Sufism. She later divorced, but went on to obtain many, many degrees, mashallah, has translated and written more than 250 books on Islam. And I asked her to share something with all of you that is a little bit wild and crazy. And she said, well, I lived through the Iranian Revolution. And it doesn't get more wild and crazy than that, mashallah. So with that introduction, welcome, Dr. Lale.
Thank you so much, Sahar. Yes, so sorry, I was not able to get through to the video part, so I'm here on the phone. But salam alaikum to everybody, and Ramadan Kareem. So I'll just be giving some comments in general about the Quran and the context and what I learned and so forth. So to begin with, the revelation of the Quran is a miracle, the most important miracle of Islam, and we can never forget this. God says in the Quran, we shall show them our signs on the horizons and within themselves, so that it will become evident to them that is the truth. That is, that God shows us the signs in the universe and within ourselves, which we reflect from the universe, so that the truth may become clear to us. Al-Ghazali tells us that we need to know ourselves in order to understand how the signs are within us. And it's not just that we have a body, but we also have a soul and a spirit as well. And he says, in a word, there is nothing closer to you than you. If you do not know yourself, how can you know anything else? Indeed, if you say you know yourself, you are in grievous error. You know nothing more about yourself than your head, face, hands, feet, flesh, and external skin. All you know about your inside is that when you are hungry, you must eat. When you are angry, you fight. When sexual appetite overcomes you, you make for the marriage act. In this, you are the equal of the beasts of burden. Therefore, you must seek out the truth about yourself. Why have you come to this stopping place? For what purpose were you created? What is your happiness, and in what does it lie? What is your misery, and in what does that lie? So in coming to know ourselves, we become critical thinkers, something the Quran teaches us. One of the most important elements of critical thinking is to ask questions. More than 1,000 of the 6,000 plus Quranic verses are questions. So the Quran teaches us how to think, in addition to what to think, but it's important in terms of critical thinking to know how to think. So we ask questions about the context of the Quran in order to come to know how it is presented to us. It teaches, for instance, about Quranic psychology, which is the basis for moral psychology, living our lives in accord with morality. It teaches us kindness, forgiveness, and charity, and the equality of all human beings, no matter what their race or gender. It teaches us about anger management. It teaches us to have humility, to be honest and truthful, and much more. There may be some things that I'm mentioning that are common knowledge to some of us, but the Quran, for those who are not familiar with it, the Quran was revealed over a period of 23 years and 5 months to Prophet Muhammad by the angel Gabriel. The revelation began when he was living in Mecca and then continued when he migrated to Medina. So some of the verses are Meccan verses, some of the chapters are Meccan chapters, and some of them are Medina. But some of them are also mixed. So within the Meccan chapters, you'll find Medina verses. And it doesn't make any difference. You can see it doesn't show you that this is a different concept. It's still the same revelation, which is amazing that it continued over 23 years. So the Arabic word Quran means recitation, and it occurs 70 times in the Quran as a means to tell us that we need to recite it. Some people translate the word Iqra as read, but since the Prophet could not read, it most likely means to recite, because there is a difference in English, although in some languages they don't have the difference between to read and to recite. The Quran is basically organized on length of chapter, not in chronological order. However, there is agreement on the order of the revelation of the chapters, so that I was able to produce a chronological Quran in English following the accepted orders of chapters, so you can see how the Meccan chapters work and what the Medina verses are within the Meccan chapters, or the other way around. It was written on tablets, bones, and the wide flat ends of date palm leaves, and occasionally papyrus or parchment and vellum were used. Every year during Ramadan, the Prophet would sit with his scribes as they recited the verse. He would say into what section he should appear. It has 114 chapters of varying lengths, and it is based, as I said, on length. Chapter 2 is the longest chapter and has 286 verses, where and chapter 108 has just 3 verses. The spiritual blessings come from the Arabic recitation, as we just heard Simin Qazi beautifully recite the Quran, and not the translation. That is, the spiritual blessings come from the Arabic recitation, not the translation. So even if you cannot recite the Arabic, you can listen to it being recited and follow along. However, it is through translations in a language that we know that we come to understand the Quran. A translation is not the actual sacred text, so even when we have our monthly cycle, we can read the translation of the Quran or listen to the Arabic recitation. We should not touch the Arabic script at that time. And even if we are not able to offer formal prayer, we still supplicate directly to God. It's not denying our direct connection to God, Islam or the Quran. So we should not necessarily read the Quran from the beginning to the end, but sometimes people like to read it, just open it wherever it falls and see if that verse really says something to you. If it does, if it speaks to you, then own it. If it doesn't, move on and find another verse that speaks to you until you're finally at the point where the Quran is part of you. Maybe you don't understand all of it. Maybe there are verses that don't mean much to you, but you still own it for those verses that do and those parts that say something to you. And I just wanted to kind of end with one of the most amazing discoveries that I had made in doing research about the Quran. So there is a verse in the Quran that God breathed his spirit into Adam. And according to Al-Tabari, who's a famous commentator on the Quran, he says that immediately after that, God called forth the progeny and the generative organs of the progeny of Adam. That means every human being who is going to be born. God called forth their generative organs and asked, "Am I not your Lord?" And they said, "Alasto," yes, we do believe, we accept that you are our Lord. So we have, previous to being born, agreed and accepted the covenant with God. This is chapter 7, verse 172, and it's known as the covenant with God. Well, what we later learned from science is that when the male child is born, he is not born with the semen. He's born with the generative organs in order to produce semen and produce children later when he matures. But the female child who is born with the female eggs of every child that she's going to be able to give birth to. So that means that those eggs of the female child were there present at the time of the covenant, and that means that the female child carries the Spirit of God within her. May God bless us all and give us patience to bear with this difficult time that we're going through. And as Simin Qazi has said, may we come to the part where we find the ease. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Minnow. Our next speaker, Dr. Basma Al-Ghaffar, and Sahar, if you could please share the bio. She is Vice President and Director of Education at Maqasid Institute in Ottawa, Canada, where she serves as the Associate Professor of Public Policy and consults and provides trainings internationally on policy, governance, and Muslim affairs. Basma has worked in the Canadian federal government, academia, and nonprofits, has contributed to the development of graduate-level public policy programs at the American University in Cairo, Qatar Foundation, and International Peace College of South Africa. She's the founding head of the Public Policy in Islam Master's Program at Qatar Faculty of Islamic Sciences, Hamad bin Khalifa University. Basma's passion has been research and teaching in public policy and governance in Islam, as well as Muslim history, thought, institutions, and communities. She has a PhD in public policy from Carleton University in Ottawa, where she focuses on intellectual property, pharmaceuticals, and international trade regimes. She is the author of many books, including Public Policy Beyond Traditional Jurisprudence, Thriving in a Plural World. And she's also currently working on a book on Quranic theory of invention and innovation.
Well, I was asked, alhamdulillah, to reflect upon what the solace that the Quran could give us in times of pandemics. And for me, the Quran, and hopefully for all of you, is a source of healing and guidance and mercy for the individuals, communities, and indeed for all people. During this time, the Quran has really done three things for me. First, it's encouraged a reevaluation of the relationships that are integral parts of who we are or who we ought to be. The second is that it's contributed to a better understanding of what we can do to alleviate the situation, from simple acts to much more complex systemic acts. And then three, it's provided comfort with its overriding message of mercy. So pandemics in the Quran are associated in one way or another with human behavior. The Quran teaches us that every individual is a synthesis of relationships with himself, their family, their neighbors, community, human and non-human, and of course, the divine. This interdependence is presented in such a way that no element can be neglected without damaging our divinely ordained dignity and the balance with which the world is created. These imbalances put in motion reactionary events. So the Quran tells us in chapter 2, verse 26, God does not disdain from giving the example of a flea or gnat and what is above it. As for those who believe, they know it is the truth from their Lord. And as for those who are ungrateful, or for some who reject faith, they question what God intended by this example. Many are lost by it, and many are guided, and none are lost except the dissolute. Those who break God's promise after having agreed to it or covenant, and sever what God has commanded to be joined and corrupt in the earth. Those are the losers. That's 227. So basically, what the Quran is doing in these verses is asking us to reflect on the bigger picture. Now, in the case of COVID, of course, we know it came to us through an intermediary host. We're not sure if it's a flea or a gnat, but a lot of viruses are transmitted through fleas and what is above them, which is the virus itself. And so the Quran is asking us to look, okay, when something like this happens, why is it happening? This COVID-19, this submicroscopic infectious agent has turned the world upside down. And we have to reflect, well, why did that happen? The reply comes in the form of our failures in terms of breaking promises, violating relationships upon which the balance of nature is based, upon which justice and mercy are based, and our reckless corruption of the earth. So let me be clear. This is not about finger pointing, and it's not about transfer of blame. It's about all of us. And we know this for many reasons, obviously, because we're, just, merciful, balanced people, but also because we know that early in Islamic history, in the plague of Amwes, in 638, 20,000 Muslims of the elite Muslim guard and their families were actually killed during the plague. And many of the Sahaba, or companions of the Prophet at the time, also died. So this is not about, talking, conjecturing about this is punishment or this is a reward. I don't think that's wise. I actually think that's quite dangerous. Instead, the Quran asks us to reflect on our own behavior. Corruption has arisen on land and sea due to what people have earned, so that they may taste some of what they did, perchance to reconsider. That's in chapter 30, verse 41. So the Quran is continually urging us to understand the implications of our behavior with greater depth. The cosmos is purposive out of design. Every individual, along with all created matter, is a purposeful point in the vastness of the seen and the unseen. All creation has a spiritual dimension with an inherent right to exist. The idea then is not only to guard this nature and our nature, but to recognize its sacred character. The Quran tells us that all creatures form communities like our own, and each knows its own unique prayer and praises. That's in Surah An-Nur 41. It even exhorts humans to learn from animals and from insects, both by studying their behavior and through different forms of communication. So the Quran encourages us to reflect on our relationship with ourselves, with each other, and with nature. Prophet Muhammad alayhi salatu wasalam in this regard said, nobody can call him or herself a believer if he does not love for his brethren or his or her brethren what they love for him or herself. Universally, this is known as the golden rule. The pandemic has led so many people to this realization across religious, cultural, and economic spectrums, some even well before the pandemic came into being. And it's pushing people to connect. I'm sure all of you have seen those videos going around of everybody reconsidering the way we live, the way we run our economies, the amount of pollution that, that we're spewing into the environment, and how things, excuse me, have changed since the lockdowns. Some are even suggesting that once a year we should have lockdowns so we can enable everything to come to life and we can refocus on these relationships. So the Quran also gives us guidance on how to fix things, ways that are suited for individuals, for organizations, for governments, and for a multitude of capacities and aptitudes. It prefers advice that's simple and straightforward, like giving, being generous, recognizing and appreciating and performing our duties towards others, to our family, friends, and strangers, as towards plants and animals. It also presents more complex principles related to social, economic, and political systems, like, for instance, respecting and making mandatory collective decision-making, regulating monopolies, fair trade, social welfare, environmental protection, public goods, science and innovation for a better world, debt forgiveness, among many other recommendations, gender equality. Principles that, whether taken together or applied piecemeal, rectify our mistakes and improve our collective existence. The pandemic is showing us that we cannot turn a blind eye. And I recently read that 30 African countries are paying more towards debt repayments than they are towards their health care. And this is seriously impeding their ability to deal with the pandemic. And we're all going to pay the price for that. It's not just going to be them. This is a virus that has to be eradicated everywhere for everyone to benefit. So ultimately, it comes down to our sincere efforts to do good with pure intentions. We don't want to become overwhelmed. The Quran does not ask us to go beyond our capacities. It asks us to do what we can. And it does, so it states, he who created death and life, that he may try which of you is best in deeds or actions. And he is the beloved, the forgiving, 67:2. He also said, strive hard for God, the verity of striving for him. He has chosen you and placed no hardship in your religion, 22:78. Divine law is gentle. It commands us not to go beyond our nature. God sees the depth of our hearts. He knows the limits of our powers and can judge whether or not we did our best. Yet the thought of God's knowing, what our best is, fills us with this moral anxiety and more exacting attitude towards ourselves to want to do even better. But yet again, even that is moderated by divine mercy, which is always there to welcome us and to support us if we're trying our best. And this brings me to my final point, is that the Quran and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and our Prophet, their overriding message and trait is that of mercy. God's mercy is boundless and universal. And it is actually within the fabric of everything created. And it is in the design and the words of the Quran. And it is in his messengers and Prophet Muhammad alayhi salatu wasalam particular. God's mercy is boundless and universal. My rahmah extends to all things, he states in the Quran. He also states of Prophet Muhammad that we have not sent you, but as a mercy to the worlds. He himself, the Prophet, stated, show mercy to everything on earth so that he in the heavens will have mercy on you. He also said, may the mercy of God be on one who is kind and forbearing when he sells, kind and forbearing when he buys, and kind and forbearing when he makes a demand. Each one of us is physically and morally bound by mercy. The Quran tells us, O people, be cognizant of your Lord who created you from one nafs, and from her created her mate, and propagated from them many men and women. And be mindful of God, by whom you entreat each other, and the wombs, or al-arham in Arabic. Surely God is your overseer. This is in the chapter of An-Nisa, first verse. Now I believe that the being referred to in this verse, the nafs, is the rahim, which is, the plural is al-arham, a Quranic term for which the English translation of womb is really meaningless. It doesn't convey the root meaning of that word. In a sacred narration or hadith Qudsi, we are told that it is God, Ar-Rahman, the merciful, who named the womb Al-Rahim, or a place of mercy, stressing both the physical and moral imperative of mercy among humankind as its common source. In it, he declares, I am the merciful. I created the Rahim and cleaved for her a name from my name. So whoever keeps connected with her, I will connect with him. And whoever severs ties with her, I will sever my ties with him. This sacred narration and the verse just noted from the Quran are mutually reinforcing and confirming. All people are commanded to be heedful of their Lord and the wombs al-arham that bore them, and that connect them to the original source. Understood both factually and figuratively, al-arham are connected to the mother of all wombs, which is al-rahim. It is a source for all humanity, and to whom God made a promise to keep relations only with those who keep relations with her. Ar-Rahim is both our physical and moral connection. Physically, every person is related to every other person through our original connection. The nature of these relations we are commanded to sanctify, and they're determined by their source, God or the merciful. To me, this is the meaning of being heedful. It is the meaning of taqwa towards God and towards al-arham, or the wombs. Again, we're seeing a strong rise in philanthropy around the world. American philanthropy during this crisis is the highest it's ever been. The Economist has reported that by April 24th, $5.3 billion had been donated by corporations, public charities, community foundations, and individuals that have been giving very generously. Landlords are waiving rents. People are cooking lunches for children that depended on those lunches in their schools. And programs for underserved communities are being funded a bit better. But these efforts will only last if we deepen our bonds and remain focused on our humanity. If we heed the divine call to recognize the sacredness of all life. Now we have come full circle. From the importance of reevaluating our relationships to understanding the physical and moral imperative of mercy that must guide those relationships, aligning our hearts and our actions with all the connections to life and nature in between. May God have mercy on the souls of those we have lost during this pandemic, and may He give us strength to honor their lives by rectifying ourselves and the world to the best of our abilities. That's the lens that the Quran has enabled me to see the world with. And that's my message for today.
Afra Jalabi, who is a writer and PhD candidate at Concordia University in Montreal. And her interests revolve around language, the theology of non-resistance, Quranic hermeneutics, and power with a focus on nonviolent resistance. She has worked closely with her uncle, Jawdat Said, a prominent Islamic scholar from Syria who has written on nonviolence and Quranic themes. And her dissertation focuses on philosophical hermeneutics, interpretation of literary texts, and aims to revitalize and rehabilitate Hans-Georg Gadamar's notion of dialogue, with emphasis on the relevance of power in context of political asymmetry. It is no wonder then too, with this amazing foundation and upbringing, that Afra is also active in the nonviolent Syrian resistance. She has also worked with George Mason University and NGOs to develop curriculum, trainings, and online classes for refugees in different parts of the world, with a focus on Syrian refugees. And I asked her to share something wild and crazy about herself, and her response was that in her daily life, she tries to live by finding the extraordinary in the ordinary, the big in the small, the glamorous in the mundane, and to take all the details of her life as her own ashram, or her own journey with Khidr from Surat al-Kahf. Welcome, Afra.
Thank you. Thank you for this beautiful intro. Thank you all for being here. It's an honor to be among such distinguished scholars and knowledge seekers. I think in many ways we're all scholars and we are all students. No matter how much clutter, like epistemological knowledge clutter we've accumulated, because we need to also add experiential wisdom to our journeys. Today, I want to actually discuss a little bit practical matters in our relationship with the Quran in starting this journey, this beautiful journey. Thank you, Daisy, and for the whole team for making this really an amazing gathering, virtual gathering. And I really like the title, Zoom into the Quran. And this is particularly what the Quran does. It allows us to zoom in into details and also zoom out. So during these difficult times, there are a lot of people who are questioning things, and they're falling into a reflective mode, and they want to actually deal with their text, with their religious traditions, that they may have answers. So a lot of people have returned to the Quran. They want to understand the Quran. What does the Quran say about difficult times? There are certain obstacles, especially for non-Arab speakers. This doesn't mean that Arab speakers have easy access to the Quran. The Quran is kind of a peculiar text. It's extremely accessible, but also extremely inaccessible. So I want to discuss the Quran from that kind of like the way we connect to that text, to that it is not your usual average book that you could read from cover to cover. It does not have a linear kind of structure. And Muslims, in their relationship with the Quran, they experience it not as a text, a normal text. They experience it on several levels. And I want to focus today on the 4 levels that the Quran generally is engaged in. There are other aspects as well. But generally, Muslims experience the Quran foremost experientially. It's a kinesthetic experience because they read it in their prayers. Prayer becomes a vehicle for experiencing the Quran. They're moving, they're bowing, they're going to the ground, they're doing all these things, and so the Quran is experienced in a bodily way. And this brings me to the nature of the Quranic text. It is musical, it lends itself to a recitation rather than a normal casual reading. It has a melodic, lyrical kind of nature. So it is always, it has that underlying musical tone. And that's why Muslims, when they experience the Quran, they don't experience a prose reading. They experience more something like, I would say, even an operatic experience. So it goes into that, has that audio feeling. So that's Layli said that we listen to it, and it has it, even if you understand the meaning, you experience it musically. And I know some people find the word music offensive when I connect it sometimes to the Quran, but this is like saying that Symphony Number 9 of Beethoven should be read only mathematically. You cannot change that. By design, the Quran is musical and melodic and lends itself easily to a recitation. So Muslims experience the Quran in an audio manner. And the Quran is not just an audio and experiential thing, it's also very visual. If you look at the Islamic art that has been produced through the calligraphy of Quranic verses, you also experience the Quran visually. And the very text itself has incredible, vivid visual content. It conjures images, it conjures, even when you listen to the stories, there are particular details that create this detailed imagery, visual tapestry in your mind. And the Quran draws your attention to visual details. It deals, as some of my friends and colleagues here talked about, mosquitoes and fleas and insects and little ants and the leaves falling from trees and the movement of stars and the movement of different kinds of clouds and the waves. So it draws your attention to this rich visual imagery. The other thing is, as Lale in her book's beautiful articles always reminds us, and as she did today, is the high reason, the engagement with high reason and critical thinking. The Quran actually aims to awaken you. It has this very strong rational message as well. Why don't you think? Why are your hearts locked? Why don't you reason? Why don't you reflect? Why don't you think? Why don't you question? So it engages your critical reflective reasoning. So imagine you have a kind of a certain production that engages you musically, it engages your high reason, and at the same time, it engages your aesthetic sensibilities as well. So that is the Quranic experience for many of us who listen to the Quran. I read the Quran, but to be honest with you, I listen more to the Quran and I recite it in my prayers, the passages that I know by heart. So in many ways, I engage the Quran not just as a text, except when I'm looking at specific, of course I read it, but generally it engages my intellectual capacities, because I focus, I zoom in into specific context and language, and then I cross-reference and do intertextual comparisons. But most of the time when I have the kind of leisurely time to enjoy the Quran, I choose to listen to beautiful recitations because I experience it. This explains also why there are so many verses that are repeated, because the nature of recitation and musical experiences is different from reading a normal text. And that's why you will find so many verses repeated in slightly different ways. Sometimes the exact verse, and as in Surah Ar-Rahman, that are repeated in exact tone. And some reciters, sometimes they are stopped and captured or captivated by a specific verse. So they repeat it even though it's not repeated in the Quranic text, because it conjures that feeling. If you notice, sometimes when we read Surah Yasin, we stop at that phrase where people in Jannah say to each other, like they give greetings of peace to each other. And we repeat sometimes that verse in our usual readings of Yasin. So I want to emphasize this kind of experiential nature in our relationship with the Quran. And this is not a coincidence, because the Quran itself places a great emphasis on experience, not just book knowledge. And this is because it emphasizes knowledge in an epistemological sense, that it is extremely important. But that knowledge does not grow if we do not open our sensibilities and our intellectual abilities to receive that which is new, and that allows knowledge to grow. But also to have the capacity to discern things and to have wisdom in where knowledge has feet to walk, where knowledge is practiced and it's not just sitting in books and on shelves. So the Quran zooms into your personal experiences. It touches you in your daily difficulties and in the experiences of pain and suffering, and then expands that personal experience to a different horizon. So it discusses the suffering and the ordeals of civilizations and entire nations and cultures. So it moves you from the personal to the collective, and it moves you from the experiences of comfort to experiences of torment. So it stretches your horizons. It moves you from different polarities to expand your way of thinking, because it deconstructs your patterns, your cultural patterns, and your sensibilities. So in many ways, it does this in the text itself. So for example, as I've been saying, the Quran sometimes is inaccessible or sometimes is not easy to read because it doesn't have a linear structure. It moves in different ways. It's circular, it's multi-layered, it's multi-angled, which actually makes it accessible paradoxically, because you can open any chapter or any verse. Any verse is a window to the Quran, and any chapter is a gate. So the Quranic text itself is structured in ways that challenges our linear ways of thinking about the world. So you can open any passage and suddenly you have been actually welcome into that passage. However, the Quran is also a self-referential text. So it shows you that this is done on purpose, because there is an exception to that. In Surah Yusuf, Surah number 12, about the Prophet Joseph, the story starts from the beginning in a very linear fashion, and it ends, and it has rich characters and a very suspenseful plot. It's one of the Quran in the third verse of that surah says, "Nahnu naqussu alayka ahsan al-qasas." We relate to you the best of narratives, or the best of stories, or the most beautiful stories. So the Quran actually offers you also a traditional linear text in its movement. So by that showing you that this text is capable of providing linear text if it wants to do that, and therefore that the non-linear, multi-angled Circular text is done by intention because it deconstructs your conceptual blockage of the world, because we are caught up in language categories, and we move in linear ways, and the way we think about time is also very linear, and the way we think about our cultures is also very limited. We are stuck in our personal lives, we are stuck in our cultural context, and so the Quran opens these possibilities into a larger horizon. And that's why I was very pleased when my friend and sister Lale Bakhtiyar said, referred to the verse 53 in Surah 41 in Surah Fussilat, that we shall show them our signs in the horizons and in themselves. فِي الْآفَاقِ وَفِي أَنفُسِهِمْ. And exactly because we move from the personal to the larger horizons, and we can only relate to bigger issues from our personal context. And our personal context falls into perspective when we see a larger horizon. So in this moment, we are in a state of shock, we're in a state of apprehension, we have not experienced a pandemic in our generations, we read about it in history. And yet, when the Quran moves us into, as my friend Basma here pointed out, into this larger context of civilizations that have went through ordeals and how they went through their own cycles of prosperity, but also they had severe consequences when they fell out of balance. Then you come back to the context and you find yourself that this is not the biggest thing that has happened to humanity. In fact, in many ways, as Basma was pointing out, it has brought blessings with it. It is a certain consequence of falling out of balance. And these things are part of the cycles of cultures and civilization, just as difficulties and ordeals are part of our personal journeys. And this is part of the larger Quranic paradigm about rahmah, that we are constantly being fine-tuned and directed in our navigations of life. And that's why I want to come back here to the issue of the consequences rather than punishment. The Quran emphasizes individual responsibility because that's where action is. The Quran stresses the importance of being present in our time frame. And that's why it deconstructs these kind of linear structures of time, to come back to the moment and to act from the moment, and to also act from our individual agency. But when it discusses consequences, when it comes to individuals, are relegated to akhirah, to the notion of a specific exact accounting in the day after. But when it discusses collective consequences, it discusses the nature or the balances and imbalances of our cultures. So the Quran, in order to actually give us a sense of the directive of this way of that our actions have consequences, gives us something that applies both to the individual context and to the collective context. And there is a verse in Surah As-Sajda, Surah 32, verse 21, and it reads, وَلَنُذِيقَنَّهُم مِّنَ الْعَذَابِ الْأَدْنَىٰ دُونَ الْعَذَابِ الْأَكْبَرِ لَعَلَّهُمْ يَرْجِعُونَ. We shall make them taste that, we shall make them have a taste of lesser torments, before making them face bigger torments, so that they may turn around, or that they may reverse their path. Basically, they may correct themselves. And so this is part of, as Basma was suggesting, part of a larger paradigm of rahmah. So even these difficulties are ways of fine-tuning and guiding our journeys. So with this, I want to send you prayers for health, for safety, and thank you all for being part of this beautiful congregation for this virtual halaqah. Thank you.
Dr. Ashe Kadayefsheh is a research affiliate at Georgetown University for Women, Peace and Security, adjunct professor at Georgetown University, and a senior fellow at the Center for Global Peace. She has also served as the assistant professor and associate director of Georgetown's Master of Arts program in conflict resolution, and the associate director at Salon Institute for Peace and Justice. Aisha's experience includes research, programming in conflict resolution and development in the Middle East and North Africa, intergroup and interfaith mediation and dialogue facilitation, gender responsive programming, and evaluation and monitoring. She is co-author of An Anthology on Islam and Peace and Conflict Resolution in Islam, Precept and Practice, and on the significance of religion in conflict and conflict resolution in the Religion Matters book series. And I asked her, share with us something, please, a little bit wild and crazy. And in spite of this illustrious academic background, she said, I think one of the crazy things that I've done is I've gone back to school to study computer science at the age of 45, and I'm still a student, mashallah. Welcome, Dr. Aisha.
Thank you so much for having me, and Ramadan Kareem for everyone. And this is such a wonderful event, and I'm so happy to be part of it. So this has been a very challenging time for me in many ways, as I can imagine it's been for all of you as well. So when I feel really stressed out, feel challenged, one of the things that I like to do is to look at the Quran for guidance and to reflect upon it. And I know that the Quran says it is one of the greatest acts of worship to reflect upon the Quran. But for me, what is the most comforting is to look at the God's names that are in the Quran and then to try to understand the meaning of it, of what I'm experiencing through that experience. So reflecting on the Quran helps me stay more healthy in social, psychological, and spiritual ways as well. And so for me, zikr and the praying are really central. So I wanted to share with you how this pandemic made me reflect on some of the names and some of the verses in the Quran. As my sisters mentioned, in the Quran, we know that everything comes from God. The good and what we feel as not so good sometimes, the hardship and the ease, as my sister Sini mentioned. So when I looked at what was happening, I had realized that one of the names that I never thought significantly before was very important in this time. This was the name of Kabd. Kabd and Bast are two names that are very much related. Kabd means contraction, withholding. And Bast, on the other hand, means openness, expansion, elevation. The Quran tells us in the second surah, verse 245, that it is God who contracts and expands. As the whole of existence is in God's hands and everything in the heavens and in our hearts comes from God, it is who directs, disposes everything for us. So Kabad is the contraction caused by God's another name, Jalal, or majesty. And Basit is the expansion caused by God's other name, which was mentioned before, the name Rahma, and also Jamal, the mercy and grace. While his majesty, through the name Kabad, reminds us God's omnipotent power, his authority, and his wrath, Rahman, or associate with Bast, reminds us of God's endless mercy, generosity, forgiveness, and his love for creation. So we experience the name Kabd when we're in distress. We feel trapped, suffer from spiritual obstruction, blockages. And it is often accompanied by feelings of fear, perplexity, spiritual emptiness. Bast, on the other hand, helps us feel elevated. It is when we feel God's hand lifting us up, when we feel relief, when we feel the blockages are going away, and when we can develop spiritually and emotionally. So it manifests itself in joy, excitement, openness to the world. Thinking about these words, we actually experience these words every day at different times of the day, maybe. But when I look at the experience of this pandemic, it made me think that we are experiencing the name Kabad globally as we are going through this experience, these challenges. We're feeling obstructed, we're feeling isolated, we're experiencing so many different challenges. But if we take this opportunity to reflect, we can see the silver lining and attune to the message of guidance in the Quran, which God says all these are, even the hardships are a blessing, and the Quran is a blessing for us to reflect on these. For Sufism, I come from a lineage of Sufi grandmothers who are students of Tasawwuf, who have influenced the way I look at things. These two names are one of the very first stations on our journey to God, and it represents both hope and fear. and it presents us with challenges as well as trials, but also allows us to enjoy our connection with God at a deeper level. So one of the things that I think the period of Qabd helps us remember is that that we are, as human beings, can be the worst of all creation or the best of all creation. We have a tendency to forget. We tendency to forget God's blessings, the blessings that we have in our lives. I think when we look at this moment, the moments of Qabd help us appreciate, as my sister was saying, the small things that we have in our lives. It helps us to put in perspective what is truly important in our life. When we go shopping now, it becomes the most important thing ever, but we go and get our basic needs. We used to be spending so much time in front of our internet or computers, connecting, watching social media perhaps, maybe some of us did. But now we remember, because now that we are isolated, the importance of social connection. And also it reminds us our place in the universe almost. I mean, we have become to some extent, as a civilization, as a global human being, a group, quite arrogant. And we have assumed that this whole world belongs to us and we can take advantage of it. But of all things that we have come to achieve, it's the smallest, tiniest creature that cannot be seen with eyes, have put us into our place and sent us to our homes to perhaps reflect on what we have done. And I think this Ramadan should be a time for us to reflect our own behaviors and to learn from our experiences or from our own limitations, and to also remember the blessings that we have. And I think for me, one of the most comforting verses in the Quran is the Surah Rahman, which has been emphasizing the purpose of the creation, God's limitless mercy, and also the balance that my sister Basma was talking about, the balance in the universe, and how we have as human beings been offsetting this balance. The other thing that when I look at the Quran, another name that comes to me a lot is the importance of sabr, patience. And in the Quran, during the hardships, God recommends us to reflect and be patient, to endure all these hardships. The Quran calls the believers to endure the hard times they face with gratitude and humility. And when we think about our beloved Prophet's life, peace be upon him, he also endured extreme hardship. For example, when he was under siege, his beloved wife Hatijah died, some of his closest companions died, but he always reflected and always emphasized the importance of patience. So I just wanted to share with you that a new research that I found that also talked about the importance of Surah Rahman for Muslim women, which was kind of surprising. It's a group of scholars that looked at the relationship between overcoming depression in Muslim women and Surah Rahman. And they found some evidence that Muslim women who recite the Surah Rahman and read the Surah Rahman tend to recover from depression quicker. And I found that to be helpful for me. And I found it to be helpful to reflect on the names of the God and to be more humble, to be more open to learning from my experiences and from these hardships. It's not always easy, but I think one thing that God also says is that while Qabd is part of his wrath and Bast is mercy, he says, my mercy overcomes my wrath. And I think that is a message for us, that importance for us to be forgiving, us to be humble and merciful to the creation, as well as seeking mercy. Thank you so much.
Sheikha Mariam Kabir has been guided on the spiritual journey throughout her life. Born in a liberal Jewish family in Hollywood, she was guided to travel and reside in spiritual centers around the world. And in 1975, she embraced Islam with an ancient sheikh near the tomb of the Prophet Ibrahim alayhi salam. She was then guided to Sheikh Bawa Muhyiddin radiallahu anhu, with whom she studied intensively in Philadelphia and Sri Lanka for many years. After he left this world in 1986, Sheikha Maryam continued to travel with him spiritually and was then guided to other great Sufi masters in West and North Africa, after whom she received the mantle of Sheikha in the Muridiya and Mustafawiya Sufi orders. As the garden of Allah's grace ever continues to grow and blossom within her, she travels around the world, physically and virtually, to transmit the endless blessings being received. And Sheikha Maryam has written a prize-winning book, a memoir called Journey Through 10,000 Veils, The Alchemy of Transformation on the Sufi Path. Her home and her heart are a refuge for seekers of truth, and her door for seekers is always open. And I asked Sheikha Maryam to share something wild and crazy about herself. And she shared that basically leaving America, flying in her younger years, leaving America, flying to Europe, traveling on the Orient Express to Afghanistan, Pakistan, India, Nepal, and throughout Europe in a journey in search of liberating truth was pretty wild and crazy. And she didn't know where she was going. She had no concrete plan. She traveled for hours on trains, made a bed on a luggage rack in a train, slept on wood piles and hilltops. And eventually, mashallah, her journey has led her to where she is. So welcome, Sister Maryam, mashallah.
Daisy, if you could put Maryam as, yeah.
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين الرحمن الرحيم مالك يوم الدين إياك نعبد وإياك نستعين اهدنا الصراط المستقيم صراط الذين أنعمت عليهم غير المغضوب عليهم ولا الضالين آمين. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu. This is a holy gathering, and I'm weeping from joy. Every word that was spoken, every knowledge, every drop of knowledge transmitted is part of a collective. It's a collective message of mysteries and teachings that each one of us is a recipient of, and then a giver of grace. So all the things I plan to say have already been said, and that's a sign that we're all united in the light here, and that the messages are working integrally in a very deep sense to become forth. And I was just touched by everything that everyone said. The first beautiful opening with the Quran is the surah that I say more than any other. And it is the shifa for us on the journey wherever we are, to understand, to come into realization that surely with every difficulty comes ease, and the ease is the grace of Allah, the wisdom and the purity and the power of Allah's grace, for which He created us to know and worship in ibadah. So I wanted to talk about the time we're in as a wonderful opportunity for spiritual advancement for each and every one of us. And the fact that we have an ever-growing circle is important for me personally, because every life is sacred and every sister, every brother, everyone who is seeking to communicate with another living being on the journey to God is a sacred friend of mine. So it would be very good if we do have ways of communicating with each other, particularly when there's a need for spiritual friendship. I wanted to read something about pandemics, a hadith. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. I'm going to use this magnifying glass. It says, Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. It's called Prophetic Guidance During Epidemic Disease, Social Distancing, Quarantine, and Confinement. If a person in the time of an epidemic plague stays in their home, patiently hoping for Allah's reward and believing that nothing will afflict them except what Allah has written for them, then they will get the reward of a martyr or shaheed. So it's an amazing time to be alive right now, whether the death comes in the time of the pandemic or whenever Allah has willed it for us. First of all, it's very important to know that death is not anything to be a terror for us, but it's something to be prepared for. So every act we do, every good deed that we do, we will see it on the last day. Therefore, this knowledge is inspiring us to do better deeds and to love more, to care more, to share more. And I have never had a Ramadan, this is my 45th year, in which there was more sharing, more loving, more caring amongst Muslims and other than Muslims. The heart is opening, the heart is rising to up through the challenge. And I would like to encourage us each and every one of us to be in the state of taqwa no matter what's happening, and in the state of loving Allah as He so greatly loves us, of listening to His messages internally, and also know that He tells us repeatedly He hears the one who calls. So we need to make dua as our life blood flows through us, and make that dua conscious day by day, day by day. Don't feel that you have to be scared and depressed by what is happening. It's an invitation to awakening for all of us, individually and collectively. And I wanted to read something that just came to me in an email, but I've been aware of this brother who's speaking so beautifully, and he's talking about the pandemic also. And it says, it says that there is a juxtaposition between seclusion and love. And he's talking about the book of isolation, which follows the Kitab as-Suha of the book of company, intimacy, and friendship. I'm taking little notes from it. We are in a global itikaf at this moment. Every human state has an appropriate spiritual response and sunnah. People are logging on to more and more spiritual activism. There is a certain movement of the spirit that is more discernible as the hadith indicates. The shaitan is chained up in the month of Ramadan. The whole world is going into a state of deep asceticism, fasting from many of the pleasures, and the heart is being liberated. As the shayateen are being chained up, the angels are being unchained, and the heart begins to move again. I just wrote that and I couldn't read my own writing, but I think we need to understand, moving with Surat al-Inshirah, that whatever the difficulty we may ever be going through, let's think about birth itself. And those of us who are women have been through it. There's the contraction, and then the beautiful baby is born. There's contraction, expansion with the breath, and then the child is born. The child is within us that is being born now. And it comes from ibadah, it comes from love, the love of Allah. And you have to keep your hands in a state of receptivity as the descent of grace is coming to us and coming through us. And so it's a matter of attitude to some degree or other, that when you want to be positive, there's so much to thank Allah for, that He even brought us to this all together. And this gathering that we're having, how many names of people I don't know yet, but I will. This is the treasure that He's giving us, person by person. So there are ways of helping people by the wonderful, extraordinary things that all of the people here are doing, the social work, the beautiful social work. And then right within that is the heart-to-heart communication, soul to soul, and where we take those phrases of the Quran that give life to our souls and remind ourselves to say them, and remind ourselves to share them, to live in this atmosphere. Right behind me is the Tree of Life, and it was made in Kashmir, our beloved home. And so for the last 35 years, I've been selling these tapestries to affirm that the Tree of Life is in bloom, that all flowers are blooming together, and the birds are singing together. And if we can't see it on the outside, we can feel it within. But even we have glass windows around here in a big yard. Well, the air is so much clearer, and the animals are singing, and they're rebounding from oppression and various forms of oppression. So what we are praying for right now is that all people in all the areas of the world who are suffering from oppression may rise up. May our prayers reach them wherever they are. May our love reach the beings who are going through this trial, and that they feel the grace of God descending upon them at that moment. And I want to reiterate the point that when you ask Allah for anything, Allah is most gracious, most kind, most merciful. And what we need to ask Him for is what He tells us to ask Him for, what He's telling us now. So every time that you open either the Holy Quran or a book of Ahadith or the words of Sufi masters or other spiritual masters that are transmitting the same message, we want to be awakened to hear what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is telling us right now, and not to be focused on fear of what will come, but to be surrendered, to be open, to celebrate God's praise right in the middle of it all. And as we do that, the light of the praise goes to our neighbor, and it goes to the people in all the different countries, people at the borders, people who are seeking refuge. May our hearts become sanctuaries of peace. May we be sanctuaries of peace. And in order to do that, we have to be filled with Allah's peace, subhanahu wa ta'ala. And we ask Allah with all our hearts to fulfill the purpose for which He created us in the time that we have still on earth. And I read a message that said, even if you think death is coming, the next moment, plant the tree right now. So instead of being afraid of it, keep sustaining the beauty of Allah's grace, and let us share it. And I thank everyone so much for what they have shared in their entire life's journey throughout this precious opportunity that we have. May we fulfill the purpose for which we were created. Ameen, ameen, ameen.
Ameen. Ameen. That was beautiful. Thank you, Sheikha Maryam. I am just in awe. The chat room is full of appreciation, Devi and the team, and to all of you, our teachers. They're saying we found a spiritual home. Some are saying this has been an uplifting and beautiful experience, and they all want to continue, and they all want to connect with each other. Subhanallah, subhanallah. I'm so honored to be part of it. And I have still some more names to read.
Assalamu alaikum. Bless you all. Jazakallah khairan. It's been incredible. I'm going to get to the question right away, or a comment. I just felt a little bit triggered, and I want to speak up and leave it to the scholars here to correct if what I have understood is right or not. So my collective understanding about God is that وَالشَّرُّ لَيْسَ إِلَيْهِ, like we repeat in Hajj. So the shar, or the bad things that's happening, is not from God. And I felt triggered when I heard that it's from God. So I might be wrong, but I just wanted to bring it up and leave it to the scholars to answer. Thank you so much.
Okay, so which of our scholars, whichever scholar wants to answer that, please go ahead and answer that. So we can keep it brief, and if we can just keep it brief. Basma?
This is Lale. I don't know, I don't remember who mentioned that, but clearly the Quran says that the evil comes from what we do. It doesn't come from God. So I thank you for correcting that, whatever you had heard.
Thank you so much, Lale. Yeah, exactly. I wanted that to be clearly pointed out because whether in the verse of Inna ma'al usri yusra, al-usr, and all of the bad things are from within us, it's not from God. And I just wanted that to be clearly pointed out.
It might have been me, I was trying to say hardship, but what we might perceive those hardships as bad for us, but it's not the bad that comes to us is from God, but it's the hardships that are tested. We are tested with. We may perceive it as such, but the bad does not, evil does not come from God. I think the way I understand it from the Quran is that when we feel distant from God, is when we feel disconnected from God, that we feel those hardships more. But it's not the evil that is directed to us that is coming from the God. Maybe I misspoke it. Or maybe I could not present it the way I was trying to express it.
And also the Quran. Yeah,
yes.
I think it helps, yeah.
Okay.
Also that the Quran, as I've been emphasizing, deconstructs our calcified veils and conceptions about life and the way we perceive things. What we perceive as bad may be good. What we perceive as good may be bad. So it actually deconstructs these dualities. This our dualistic perception of life. And that's why it says, "Asa an takrahu shay'an," you may hate something and it may be good for you, and you may love something and it may be bad for you. So it destabilizes our facile categories and our kind of static ways of thinking about the world, and it opens us, as Sheikha Maryam said, to new possibilities of receiving and sharing. And so it destabilizes our narratives and the corners in which we have been stuck, and it breaks our idols. It's iconoclastic. Even what we conceive as evil may turn out to be actually the most beautiful lesson in our life. And that's why Yusuf, because I mentioned Yusuf, in all his experiences, he never said to God, I went through terrible experiences. He said, Innahu Rabbi ahsana mathwaya, my Lord who has elevated and fine-tuned my stations. Thank you.
Okay, if you have a question, just unmute yourself and ask the question.
I do see one question here from Libby that says, how do you advise we can help our daughters better understand the meaning of pandemic? I'm not sure if it's our young children you're referring to, but how could we explain simply to young children to make sense out of the pandemic?
Basma?
How can we explain to young children? There's been some really nice things produced online that give some some visuals with it and some storytelling, which can be useful. From our part, I think we can, from my perspective, explaining it to my children was from the perspective that I shared in my presentation, is to say that we have to take care of the earth better. 75% of viruses around that are transmitted through human, they come transmitted from animals to humans, and sometimes through intermediary hosts like COVID. So I've explained to them that there is a delicate balance in this world, and we've not done such a good job at being stewards, and we've not done such a good job at understanding the spiritual dimension of nature and of animals, of plants. And a lot of people still have their doubts. And for me, it boggles my mind. I mean, because the Quran is so clear about it, that everything in the heavens and the earth praises God. Everything has their mode of prayer. Even inanimate objects in the Quran, like a rock, it has its way of praising God. And so we haven't respected that. We haven't respected that balance. And this is the consequence that humanity pays, so that we may reflect and positive things can come out of it. And when we begin reflecting, we can begin to fix things. And I've asked them about how, they'd like to change the world and how they are going to change their lives to change the world. And it makes them active participants in creating a better world, rather than being in this lockdown and sitting back and thinking it's just going to happen for them once the lockdown is over. So I've encouraged them to think, well, what are you going to do differently? What are you going to do to respect the environment differently? What kind of activism are you going to take up to make sure that people are more aware of what our hands have earned, so to speak? So I think that's how I would go about explaining it, to make them better citizens of the world.
Thank you very much. Sahar, do you have any other questions? I think there are 3 people who have raised their hands, but I can't see them because there are so many people. I'm trying to scroll up and down. So.
Yes. I do see a question from Ala. Ala Nasser. Hi, Assalamu alaikum, Ala. Go ahead and unmute yourself, please. Ala, are you there?
Okay.
Hi, Ala.
Okay. Can you hear me? Salam alaikum.
Alaikum salam.
This has been really, really beautiful and amazing, and it's very inspirational. And a lot of these women I've never met before, so I'm just like feeling in awe. Thank you, Daisy. And I was just wondering, these women all have so much knowledge. Do they have websites or any kind of social media that we can connect to and learn more from them directly?
Yes, I will be sending this video along with the profiles of all of our speakers, so you can be directly in touch with them if you need to.
Okay, alhamdulillah. Okay, shukran. That's it. I'm just, I'm so happy. I'm outside and I'm like, I'm very, very grateful for this. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, Sahar, anybody else?
Let's see.
There was a question about why the Quran is non-linear and circular.
Yes.
And I wanted just to briefly address that.
Go ahead.
Yeah, our egoic journeys and the way we perceive the world is actually, it tends to be linear, and we create narratives stuck in them. And language actually is a form of prison, because it creates linguistic conceptions and it veils reality. And that's why it's not a coincidence that the culture that received the Quran actually was one of the first cultures to develop the methodologies for empirical sciences. Although the Quran is a text, but it liberates you to zoom out and to actually exit from the text into observing reality again, but observing it without conceptual barriers, linguistic barriers, and to examine things as they are, to come back to the things as they are. And so it's kind of a journey of awakening. And when we are stuck in these kind of linear ways and structured ways of thinking, it deprives us of perceiving and connecting to the world, which is actually the continued revelation of God. That's why God says that the words of God will never run out. So the revelation continues through other means. And the Quran, although it's a text, it connects us to non-textual revelation. And it is important to awaken to the limitations of language, and yet also the uses of language in much more broader terms. So I think that's why there is that both linear aspects in the Quran and non-linear, to see the functions of language and the ways we get imprisoned in language, and the ways through the use of language itself we can liberate our stuck ways of thinking.
Thank you
so much.
There's a question from Ozgul Azkan, and it's a wonderful question, mashallah. It talks about the question on hope. And do I, as a Muslim, have the right to give up on something when Allah does not give up on us? And I'd like to open that up to the scholars. We were speaking about it just before the call. Never underestimate Allah's mercy. One of my favorite verses from the Quran. But I would like to refer that question to the scholars.
Okay, who would like to take on hope? Okay, Bas. Okay, Simi, yes. So Simi hasn't spoken, so let me just give an opportunity.
I just want to quote one of my favorite verses is Hazrat Yaqub in the Quran, when he says, وَلَا تَيْأَسُوا مِنْ رَوْحِ اللَّهِ لَا يَيْأَسُوا مِنْ رَوْحِ اللَّهِ إِلَّا الْقَوْمُ الْكَافِرُونَ. So do not despair. Do not despair of the ruh, which is like the ruh being present. It's reminds me of the idea of the Shekhinah, like the spiritual consolation of Allah present. The ruh is like the ruh present with us. Don't despair of the ruh of Allah, because certainly none despair of that except those who would deny. And when you look at how he was separated from his beloved Yusuf for so many years, and given the evidence even that his son was dead, and then now Yusuf's younger brother had been held back, and so it was such a time of grief. So many years had passed of suffering for him, but he was the one who really held that center in a surah where everybody else is occupied by hum, which is anxiety, and they're kind of over-attached, and they're destroying their own destinies by this hum that they all have. But Yusuf is the one who's modeling how to hold a strong center, and so that's what I look to when I feel despair, is that particular verse.
Thank you so much. Okay.
I could add also, one of my teachers had told me that if you say that you have committed something that God will not forgive you, is putting a limit on God's mercy, which is one of the biggest sins that we can commit, because God's mercy is at the end is the endless, and we should never lose hope, and we should always maintain that hope that God's mercy will overcome everything.
Thank you. Thank you. Okay, Sahar, who's next?
There was one question back to the concept of qabd. Can one of the panelists refer us to an instance in the Quran, other than Yusuf if possible, of when Allah came to the rescue at the moment of intense qabd? Oh, yes,
Aisha? Oh, you have to unmute yourself.
Sorry, could you repeat? I was looking at the questions there to see if it was there.
Would any of the panelists like to share an instance where one Quran verse came to the rescue at a time or moment of intense qabd? I know we had spoken about Yusuf. Would there be any other instances you can think of offhand?
Musa alayhi salam.
Who's, oh, Hind? Okay.
Sayyidina Musa, the story of Sayyidina Musa alayhi salam.
Okay, go
Allah
ahead.
subhanahu wa ta'ala saved him from Fir'aun. To answer the question for another incident in the Quran where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala came and helped, the story of Sayyidina Musa alayhi salam. I know you're finishing time. I just want to add hats off to all of you for what you have presented. This should be required viewing by all women and by all young ladies. I love what you have done. I love the thoughtfulness, the thorough understanding, the compassion, and the care, looking at us as part of the whole universe, putting Islam and Muslims, the faith, as an active religion, and is that it made the whole world be aware of what's happening to the world and what we are doing to the world as human beings. We were supposed to be the vice regents. We were supposed to be the khulafa on this earth and to take care of it, and we have failed. ظهر الفساد في البر والبحر بما كسبت أيدي الناس. The corruption has been evident in the land and in the sea with what mankind has done. So it's not Allah's punishment, it's Allah's sending us a message to all of us, wake up and do something about it.
Well, thank you so much. It's 3 p.m. and I cannot believe that 2 hours have gone by so quickly. People were saying it's too long, and I said, no, it's going to go very quickly. But because when you're absorbed and you're learning and your senses are getting awakened and you are in the presence of knowledgeable people and you're absorbing, you don't even know where time it just flew by. I want to thank all of you for joining. Ask Sheikha Mariam once again to just do a parting dua so we can all go back to our homes and resume our lives. Sheikha Mariam.
A'udhu billahi minash shaitanir rajim. Bismillahir rahmanir rahim. Alhamdulillahi rabbil alamin. Ar-Rahman Ar-Rahim, Maliki Yawmiddin, Iyaka na'budu wa iyaka nasta'in, Ihdina siratal mustaqim, siratal ladhina an'amta alayhim, ghayril maghdubi alayhim, waladallin. Bismillah. Ar-Rahman Ar-Rahim. Allahumma salli ala Sayyidina Muhammadin wa ala alihi Sayyidina Muhammad wa ala wa sahbihi wa sallim. Allahumma salli ala Sayyidina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi Sayyidina Muhammad وعلى آله وسلم. اللهم صل على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم. سبحان ربك رب العزة عما يصفون وسلام على المرسلين والحمد لله رب العالمين. آمين آمين يا رب العالمين.
Ameen. Thank you, Sheikha Mariam, and thank you everyone for attending, and inshallah we will see you again next week.